let's put C1 up on the screen here. So RFK Jr. tried this kind of Hail Mary attempt to the Supreme Court to try to get off the ballots in Michigan and Wisconsin. And because of the timing of him dropping out and endorsing former President Trump, that meant that in some states he can't get his name off the ballot. You have to be pretty clueless at this point to not know that RFK has dropped out. So how much do you think that this could affect Michigan and Wisconsin? Because I can see it a couple of different ways, and I'm curious what the campaign thinks if you've heard from them on this. On the one hand, I think RFK Jr. will get a decent number of votes, like in the thousands, maybe even the tens of thousands in these states. But then the question is, what would those people have done if his name was not on the ballot? They might have just written in weed, or they might have voted
in Ryan Graham.
They might have voted Ryan Graham. They might have voted for another third party, or just left it blank. So people kind of automatically think, oh, well, he endorsed Trump, and they have voted for RFK Jr. on their ballots. That means if he wasn't there, they would have automatically voted for Trump. And I think that's a leap that you can't make. But I'm curious how, obviously they care because they went to the Supreme Court. So how big of a handicap is this for Trump in Michigan and Wisconsin?
I mean, I think it's an open question, right? As you said, they clearly care because they tried to get his name removed. But I remember months ago when Kennedy first got into the race, there was real debate over who he would hurt more. Donald Trump's campaign at one point had internal data that he would hurt them more. And so I think that's important. And now, as people heard from Kennedy more, I think, some of these, he garnered more Republicans than Democrats. But I think there are a small number of people who might vote for Donald Trump or might stay home who were backing Kennedy. And so any vote, I think, any number in this presidential election when it's so close, if the public polling is to be believed, can influence it. And so I do think that Donald Trump's campaign is somewhat concerned about it. It doesn't help them. And I do expect that, we'll probably see Kennedy out urging those voters in those states to vote for Donald Trump in the next few days.
Yeah, and in politics, I think the biggest bias that you have, especially in media, is just working in media, and you are so disconnected from the mind of the average voter who has a million different things going on, may genuinely start tuning into the election. I mean, we've been covering this every single day for over a year, but may genuinely start tuning into the election the day before they vote and looking, like Google Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, immigration numbers, healthcare, all of those things, inflation, and are like looking at the charts and whatever. But there are also people who go in there, aren't happy with the candidates, are voting for, maybe they're going to vote for Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, and they see Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name's on the ballot, and they like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and they don't like Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was campaigning pretty hard against Donald Trump just about a year and a half ago. That stuff does happen. Yeah. People really aren't happy with these two candidates. That's what he was originally campaigning on, in fact. So that stuff can make a big difference when we look to 2016 when the margin in Michigan, do you remember exactly how many votes it was? It was such a tiny...
Michigan, 100,000-ish?
Yeah.
So small. So obviously it can make a significant difference. Now, Shelby, another thing I'm curious about, let's first roll this next thought. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about what he's been promised in a Trump administration.
The key that I think that President Trump has promised me is control of the public health agencies, which are HHS and its sub-agencies, CDC, FDA, NIH, and a few others, and then also the USDA, which is key to making America healthy, because we've got to get off of seed oils.
Shelby, this is something I actually asked Senator Eric Schmidt, who's a very good friend of J.D. Vance, on Undercurrents recently, what it's been like to marry the RFK Jr. camp to the MAGA camp, bringing MAHA and MAGA together.
What's MAHA?
Make America Healthy Again.
Oh, okay.
So how are these two very disparate groups? I mean, when I went to the Rescue the Republic rally to report on it a few weeks ago, I literally saw barefoot hippies and MAGA evangelicals together, like backslapping and having fun. But internally, on the campaign side, how's everybody getting along in both of these like pretty different universes coming together?
I know that there are people on Donald Trump's campaign who are huge fans of Kennedy, and to the point where I've heard, he just talked about positions that Donald Trump has promised him. Whether or not he would get confirmed is an open question, right? You have Merck and Collins on the Help Committee they're not going to vote to get Kennedy into any confirmable position. But I've heard that Trump's campaign believes that it is worth the fight. And so if he were to win, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a fight and a debate over Kennedy being in a confirmable position. But what's also notable is the Maha thing, as you noted. Donald Trump really never mentioned that before Kennedy got on board, but they really embraced Kennedy's sort of obsession with public health and with, the obesity crisis and with childhood chronic illnesses. And that's what the campaign has added in the last few months upon bringing Kennedy on board. And they're really letting Kennedy sort of run that aspect of their campaign, from my understanding.
That's really interesting, actually.
Yeah, from my perspective, heightening attention on all of those chronic problems is a wonderful thing. His solutions sometimes kind of coming out, I'm not so sure about that.
Well, what I think is interesting about
But at least it's like attention on it.
Just the idea of we all know Republican campaign operatives and we know Republican campaign consultants, really blue blazer crowd that changed a little bit when Trump got into the picture, but not entirely. And so to even have them, to the point you just made, genuinely outsourcing some outreach to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his motley band of heterodox, interesting, eccentrics, that's actually a pretty crazy dynamic, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show, A, how close this presidential race is, but B, how the thinking inside Trump world has really changed. You have Tulsi Gabbard also that they brought in. So you do have some of these folks that, in 2016, it would have been, it's still eyebrow raising, but in 2016, it would have probably been unheard of. I can't imagine that happened in 2016. And now you're seeing it with Tulsi Gabbard, you're seeing with RFK Jr., you're seeing all of these sort of folks that never would have been involved in a Trump campaign are now involved in a Trump campaign. And they're not only involved, but they really are being embraced by Donald Trump's folks and his longtime aides.
While we've got you, and we've mentioned Michigan, I'm curious how the campaign is interacting with the kind of Arab American and Muslim American vote. You had a rally recently, where they had a decent number of Muslim speakers. The Yemeni American group has endorsed the Trump administration. This PAC, which is a hilariously named Pakistani American Political Action Committee, they endorsed Trump. But I'm curious, from internally, how do they think about this kind of unexpected support that they're getting from that community? And do they actually talk about what they would do when it comes to the proximate cause of this support, which is the genocide in Gaza? Do they talk ever? Do you ever hear if we win, we actually have to do something about this question? And what would they do? Or is it more we'll think about that later?
I think it's more, and to be clear, this is not my key focus, so I don't always ask about this, but when I do talk to the Trump campaign about the issues they are most focused on, this is not necessarily in the top 3 or 4, because they look at what the majority of voters are worried about. And so what you hear them talking about publicly a lot is oftentimes what they're talking about privately, which is the economy, which is the border.
Same with the Harris
inflation.
Campaign. Yeah.
Exactly. But they're seeing this as a gift. Again, they'll take whatever voters they can get. And so if all of these people are really frustrated at Kamala Harris for her non-action or non-comments and are willing to give Donald Trump a chance, they're totally fine with that. Now, whether or not, if Donald Trump wins, that ends up with some sort of serious new legislation that they will like, I'm not totally convinced.
Or does it or does it even blunt? Meanwhile, over at Drops Out yesterday, we just reported on this thing, Project Esther, that the Heritage Foundation is putting out, which is basically saying we're going to try to round up and deport anybody who's on a student visa or on any kind of visa and is protesting on behalf of Palestinian rights, and otherwise do a kind of massive kind of legal and political campaign to dismantle any criticism of Israel. So
if they can connect it to what's called by we know how these designations work, these dubious sometimes dubious, sometimes serious connections to terrorism.
Right. So there'll be this pressure from that wing of the kind of right. But does the fact that he's up on stage with a bunch of Muslims change that at all, or no?
And I'll add, my understanding is that this outrage campaign is being led by Tiffany Trump's father-in-law, right? So these are literal family ties.
Yeah, they're family ties.
He's Lebanese, is that right? Yeah.
Whether it makes a difference, I don't know, right? I don't know if to be clear, I don't know if anything at this point in the race is going to make a significant difference. I think the vast majority of voters have already made up their minds. And for what it's worth, when Donald Trump's campaign is talking about some of those persuadable voters this late in the race, again, James Blair yesterday told me that what they're mostly focused on is a group of younger, under 50, mostly white, but still like a quarter of them are minorities, men. And so that's the group that they're viewing as the most persuadable for their campaign. So it's not necessarily Muslims, it's not necessarily women, it is men under 50, mostly white, but a solid number of them are Black and Hispanic as well. And so that's where they see those persuadable voters a week out of the presidential race.
Well, Shelby, if you couldn't tell, we find your reporting very valuable. We kept going.
Tell Ben that so I can do my job.
Shelby Talcott, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us some of your time on this very, very busy week.
Anytime.
All right, we'll be back with more soon. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.